Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to week 5 of these talks on larger us changemaking. Over the last 3 weeks, we've been looking at defusing, how we respond to perceived threats, how we can build belonging through our work as changemakers, how we can bridge divides with political opponents, and today we're going to be talking about the final installment, which is about navigating. Now, when we talk about navigating, what we're really referring to is how we ourselves and then all of the people that we work with, our supporters and our communities and so on, how we navigate that long crisis that we talked about in the very first week of these talks, this sense of multiple different crises all flying at us, creating kind of shocks and stresses and disruption and breakdown, all of which comes with a kind of mental toll as much as anything else. And in particular, in this talk, I want to steer into the idea of shared loss, which, as we'll discover, is a really big deal politically. So what do we mean when we're talking about shared loss? Well, think, for example, of what we all experienced over the last 2 or 3 years of COVID-19. Many of us obviously experienced the loss of people close to us. Many of us experienced loss of some of our health due to long COVID. Many of us experienced loss of income, or maybe kind of loss of important experiences in life, like think how many students missed out on graduations, for example. And when we look at the cost of living crisis that we're living through right now, that also involves deep experiences of shared loss for many of us. There's the loss of warmth in our homes, the loss of income again that many people are experiencing, and also the loss of certainty about the future, about what kind of prospects we have and what we can expect or take for granted. Now, well, both of these examples are kind of classic sudden onset shocks that then come with emotional stages afterwards. This is a graph that's come from the Department of Homeland Security in the United States, and it's a very stylized version of the kind of emotional stages that communities often go through in the wake of a disaster or a big shock. And you can see that after the moment of impact, there's often what's called a honeymoon period, which is hallmarked by tremendous community solidarity, by people really coming together to get through the challenge. Think back to those first the first COVID lockdown and the mutual aid groups that we saw, or the clapping for carers that happened here in the UK. Many people will have experienced a sense almost of exhilaration at how much coming together they were experiencing in the community. But as you can see in this graph, what typically happens after that is a long period called disillusionment. And this is where things like money worries or relationship stresses or health concerns can all start to kick in. We're realizing how much will never go back to normal after the disaster. And at this stage, we can really feel overwhelmed, exhausted, just completely depleted as these stresses and pressures build up. And in addition to the emotional stages that we have after kind of sudden onset disasters, there's also experiences of shared loss that can unfold in a slower burn fashion. Think, for example, of the shared loss that many communities feel with gentrification, where people who've grown up in neighborhoods who call them home may suddenly question whether they still belong there, whether they're still welcome, or whether they can still afford to live there. That too is an experience of shared loss. Look at the state of so many high streets in British towns and the feeling of loss that engenders in those towns, this sense of the loss of a kind of center, and also the loss of the sense of community well-being that comes from a feeling that the place is thriving. And of course, this can happen as well where towns or cities lose whole industries. This picture here is of a textile mill in Keighley, just down the road from where I live in Yorkshire. It used to employ 400 people. It was in lots of ways the beating heart of the town. And now this is the state it's in. And again, it's an experience of shared loss. And if there's one thing I want to pick out here is that feelings of shared loss in these examples that we've been talking about go far beyond just the kind of economic loss that may be involved. What's often involved is a loss of identity as well, of group identity. And this is a really big deal politically, as well as for our well-being, as we'll explore now. And I want to steer in particular to the idea of grievance as something that can emerge and be preyed upon when shared loss is not mourned for in the way that it needs to be. One of the top experts in the world on this whole area is a psychiatrist called Vamik Volkan, who's an expert on group identity and also on conflict reconciliation. And as you can see here, he observes that the main task of any large group is to protect that large group's identity. And he goes on in his writing to explain that when a large group, like people in a country, go through a deep experience of shared loss, then the need to shore up that group identity may take the form of kind of really focusing on that shared feeling of loss so that it actually becomes central to the group's identity, at which point the group becomes very vulnerable to exploitation by a manipulative political leader. So let's look at an example of what that looks like in practice. Take Russia, which until 1989 was one of course, the two great superpowers in the world. But with the fall of the Soviet Union, the country entered a traumatic period of shared loss, not just the fact that its economy was imploding, leaving millions of people on the breadline, but also the loss of kind of self-respect, of self-belief, of feeling like a kind of great power. And Vladimir Putin has been expert in the way that he's been able to prey on those feelings of shared loss, on that kind of shared trauma that so many Russians experience, and turn it into feelings of grievance. And this, of course, has been central to how he's been able to whip up widespread public support for his war in Ukraine. Shared loss, not properly mourned for, becomes grievance in the hands of a manipulative political leader. Or for another example, look at the United States. One of the interesting statistics about the January 6 riots was that the single strongest predictor of whether someone would take part in those riots was coming from an area where the white share of the population was in steep decline. And this teases out another really important aspect of shared loss, which is that shared loss doesn't have to be a feeling that anyone else regards as legitimate. If that's how it feels to the people involved, and they then start acting out on that feeling of grievance and shared loss, then it can quickly become everyone else's problem, exactly as happened with the attacks on the Capitol. And of course, Donald Trump is right at the center of this story with a narrative of shared loss. Make America Great Again is a story about how America used to be great, isn't anymore. It's a narrative of shared loss with large amounts of grievance stirred into the mix. And there's so many other political leaders who use the same playbook. Think of people like Nigel Farage in the UK or Marine Le Pen in France. So those are just a few examples of how shared loss can be turned into grievance. But what's the alternative to this? How can we mourn shared loss in a healthy way such that it doesn't toxify and turn into this kind of political grievance? Well, Vamik Volkan also has lots to say about grieving as the alternative to these processes of grievance. And it's worth picking up that one of the kind of foundations of grieving is that it starts with the work that we do ourselves, that if we want to be the change that we want to see in the world as change makers, then knowing how to grieve and being able to lean into those experiences of shared loss is really fundamental. And one point worth teasing out immediately here is that grief comes in a lot of different forms. It's not just grief for lives that have been lost, although of course that's the most obvious example. We can also grieve things like loss of attachment, like relationships, loss of territory, of places where we feel like we belong, loss of structure, of a sense of our role in society or identity of who we are. And then also, to come back to something we touched on earlier, the importance of things like loss of a sense of the future, of where we're all going together, of what our sense of kind of collective meaning is, and also the loss of certainty, of predictability. All of these are experiences of shared loss that need to be grieved for. But of course, grieving is hard. It's something that we can often be tempted to turn away from because we know that opening up to grief and experiencing it is so painful. But the thing is that although grieving is hard, the alternative is even harder. Because as grief expert David Kessler puts it, while grief is work, avoiding grief is even more work. Think of how it's possible to kind of avoid grief and the result instead is long-term depression or alcoholism or substance abuse. These are sort of just examples at the personal level of how grief not attended to and not honored in the proper way can lead to kind of even more pain as it just builds up and curdles inside us. And it also has consequences for other people as well. Tabitha Mpamira Kaguri is an expert on collective trauma. And one of her observations is that trauma not transformed is trauma transferred. And what she's really getting at here is that when there's any kind of collective trauma, again, we need to lean into it to kind of open up to the pain and work through it. Because if we don't do that, if we just try and shut it away in a box, then what often happens instead is that the trauma gets transferred frequently to the next generation. So there's a whole field of study about inherited trauma and how it can be passed from one generation to another. So these are some of the reasons that we need to be able to grieve individually for experiences of loss. The good news then is that grieving is not something that we have to undertake on our own. On the contrary, all through history, grieving is something that humans have tended to do collectively, in groups, in communities, and so on. And in fact, our society is very unusual in how much we regard grief as something that's private, that's almost shameful at some level, that we're scared to do in public or to show that we're grieving. But actually, when we do grieve together with others, it can be powerfully transformative. And it's something that's beautifully captured in a story from Rwanda in the aftermath of the genocide in 1994. One of the things that happened after the genocide was that a lot of well-meaning Western psychotherapists went to Rwanda to try and help survivors of the trauma to work through what had happened to them. But as one story told by a survivor called Solomon recounts, that didn't always work so well. Solomon says that of these Western psychotherapists, their practice did not involve being outside in the sun where you begin to feel better. There was no music or drumming to get your blood flowing again. There was no sense that everyone had taken the day off so that the entire community could come together to try to lift you up and bring you back to joy. Instead, the psychotherapists would take people one at a time into these dingy little rooms and have them sit around for an hour or so and talk about bad things that had happened to them. In the end, we had to ask them to leave. So it's a beautiful account of how it was just understood in Rwanda that grieving and processing that collective trauma was something that needed to be done together in order to lift people up and bring them back to joy. And we can incorporate much of this work of collective grieving into our work as change makers. We can make powerful contributions to assisting and honoring those necessary processes of grieving for shared loss. One extraordinary example in the last couple of years has been the way that the National COVID Memorial Wall in London took shape. If you remember, the British government was very reluctant to allow any kind of processes or places for shared grieving about COVID-19 because it was scared that it would get blamed for its own handling of the pandemic. But as a result of that, a civil society group led by donkeys created this memorial wall on the wall of the South Bank opposite Parliament in London. And it became this extraordinarily powerful place for shared grieving in a very participatory way. Anyone could show up, add a heart to the wall with a message for someone that they had lost. And it's still there today, a kind of beautiful process of shared grieving for the enormous amount of loss that took place during COVID-19. Another example that I saw at close hand when I was working at Avaz, the online citizen group, was what happened after the bombing in Manchester that took place at the Ariana Grande concert there a few years back. Obviously, Manchester as a city was in a state of shock, and people all over the world wanted to find ways of expressing their love and solidarity towards Manchester. And what some colleagues of mine at Avaz did was put together an action where they invited people to send in a message of love and support for Manchester, posted them on a website, but then also hired billboards and advertising vans all over the city to drive around with these messages of love and support, a beautiful expression of solidarity and shared grief together with the citizens of Manchester in the aftermath of that terrible event. And these kind of ways that change makers can assist grieving for shared loss aren't limited to situations where people have died. It can also be different kinds of shared loss. And finally, one of my favorite examples of that is what happened in Germany when the last deep coal mine in the country was closed down. Now, for lots of climate activists like me, this was a day of triumph, of celebration for the fact that all of these emissions would never take place. But of course, for coal miners, it was a profound experience of shared loss. And something that Germany got so right in that situation was honoring and acknowledging and respecting that loss. Rather than just closing the mine and serving the miners with redundancy notices, they created a really visible national ceremony where the president of Germany, the man here in the glasses, was ceremonially presented with the very last lump of coal to be dug up from the coal mine. And the whole country, in effect, was invited to kind of take part in this, this moment of acknowledging the deep loss felt by so many coal miners. So that's just some thoughts about shared loss, how the kind of perma-crisis that we're living through is going to throw all sorts of shared loss at us. And it's so important that we grieve for those experiences of shared loss well together. If we don't, the risk is that it can become a source of grievance, particularly in the hands of a manipulative political leader. But we as change makers can do much individually in how we model our behavior, collectively in groups, and at the societal level to create spaces for that process of collective grieving for shared loss. And in the next talk after the break, we'll look at some of the ways that we can help to restore hope as well.